You have been one of the main forces behind the development of the field known as Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience. Can you just describe what that is, what it covers, where it fits in?
It's a hybrid interdisciplinary field that combines developmental psychology with cognitive neuroscience. So it studies the development of cognitive functions like memory, reasoning, etc. It studies the neural bases of those cognitive functions, and it studies the development of those neural bases. And you can look at it in terms of the genetic factors that affect that, the environmental factors that affect that, the inter-individual differences, how those become disrupted in disorders, things like that.
The leadership forum that we're having here in the next couple of days is on the topic of contemplative education. Can you say what that means for you and where you see its relevance in terms of schools and education of children?
Well, I'm not sure what it means, but when I think about it, I think about children learning to be able to slow down and think before they act and understand better their own minds and more accurately perhaps perceive what's happening in the world around them. For example, a lot of times we read meanings into things that we see or hear, and that's not actually what they meant at all. And I think part of contemplative education can help children see that something is, and then we add interpretations onto that which may or may not be true. But my work looks at executive functions, which depend on prefrontal cortex. And one of the most important has to do with self-control or discipline or self-regulation, being able to do what's most appropriate or what's best, even though that might not be your first inclination, even though that might not be your first impulse. And children can really benefit in education from learning strategies and aids to being able to do that, from being able not to go with their first impulse, but instead do what is really most needed or most appropriate.
So I wanted to come to some definitions of terms, and one of them is executive function. What, in layperson's terms, what is meant by executive function?
Executive functions refers to a set of cognitive functions which are important for cognitive control and which depend centrally on prefrontal cortex of the brain. By cognitive control, it means when you have to think about what you're doing as opposed to going on automatic. The opposite of executive functions is when going on automatic would work. You need executive functions when going on automatic wouldn't be sufficient or would actually get you a bad result.
Can you give examples of both of those?
Yes, for example, let's say there's going to be somebody here this week who I haven't seen in almost 30 years. Who knows what my first reaction might be? Sometimes your first reaction when you see somebody you haven't seen in so long is, oh my God, how old you look, or oh my God, how much weight you gained. But you don't say your first impulse. You stop yourself so that your friend shouldn't feel bad. You say, how wonderful you look or something. So it's stopping and saying, no, this would hurt the person's feelings. There wouldn't be any good outcome from my saying what my first reaction is. I want to stop myself from doing that. Or I'm trying to focus on you and ignore the lights and the cameraman in the room. So I need to exercise executive function to hone in on what I want to attend to and to inhibit attention to what I want to ignore. Another example is I have a big project to do. And while I was very excited by the project at the beginning, there are times when I'm working on the project when it's really boring, or I don't know what to do next, or whatever. Or there's something coming up and that sounds like it's so much fun, I would much rather do that. I need executive function to say no. You have to stay on task. You have to keep doing it. You have to get it finished. So those are examples. Other times you don't want executive function. You want to go on automatic. I love to dance. And if I thought about what my feet were doing each moment I was dancing, I would be a terrible dancer. So those are times when you want executive function to get out of there. Don't think about what you're doing. It's like the Zen of archery. You'll do it much better if you go on automatic. The older areas of the brain have had a lot more time to evolve. They'll handle things much better than prefrontal. But if things change, if there's distraction, if I need to do it a different way, then I need prefrontal to help me, because I can't go on the usual way, because for some reason the usual way isn't appropriate in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the older parts of the brain. Again, in lay person's terms, can you talk about the brain and its evolution, its parts, its functions?
Well, one way to think about the brain is to think about the center and the covering on the outside. The covering on the outside is the cortex, and that's the newest areas of the brain. You have primary motor and primary sensory cortex, you're being able to move and see and hear. And then you have association areas of the brain that are important for integrating information, like prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, etc. And those are the last areas of the brain to mature. Prefrontal cortex isn't fully mature until you're early to mid-20s, so it takes over 2 decades for it to fully mature. It starts prenatally and then continues for the whole time. The older areas of the brain are safe inside. They're much less vulnerable to an accidental fall or a car accident or something. They're protected. And one of the reasons that they are protected is they're necessary for your survival. If I gave you a frontal lobectomy, if somebody else gave you a frontal lobectomy, or you had a car accident, and I passed you on the street, I'd never know. You'd look like a regular person. But if you have damage to the subcortex, the area deep inside, then you can't breathe, or those are functions necessary for survival. The cortex on top is icing on the cake. It's important, but it's not essential for your survival.
Mm-hmm. And Adele, I know you've done some work with monkeys. So how does a monkey brain compare in these respects to a human brain?
It's very similar. A rhesus monkey brain is quite similar to a human brain, but prefrontal cortex is far larger in the human brain. Prefrontal cortex has expanded the most in the course of evolution, and it expands the most in the course of development in any given human being. Visual cortex is more developed in the monkey because something had to give if you're going to get the whole cortex into the brain. And so the visual cortex is a bit smaller in humans. If you compare humans to rodents, our olfactory part of the brain for smell is much smaller than in a mouse or a rat or even a dog or a cat. But prefrontal cortex, the part that's important for executive function, has hugely expanded in the human.
What does the term metacognition refer to?
Metacognition refers to thinking about your own thinking. So your self-awareness of what you're thinking, your knowledge and understanding of what you're thinking.
And is that an aspect of executive function? Or how do those relate?
I don't know. It's not what I include in my standard definition of executive function. But definitions vary from individual to individual, so I think some people would include it. Mm-hmm. It's certainly an advanced cognitive skill. So maybe yes, maybe no, I'm not sure if it's part of executive function.
Mm-hmm. And can you say more about, you talked about the studies of children in the 30s and the 60s. Can you talk specifically about the educational system, the one that we're familiar with in the United States or in North America, and the challenges that you see facing it, and what kinds of changes are needed? There's a lot of concern, obviously, about the schools at this time.
I focus mostly on very young children, so let's say 3 to 6 years of age. And I think that certainly in the US, with No Child Left Behind, you have a huge emphasis on training children for passing the tests that they're going to get each year to show that the schools are meeting the national standards, for No Child Left Behind. So teachers feel under great pressure to get a lot of academic instruction in. And you see, even before No Child Left Behind, you see a progression of moving back to younger and younger ages, a way of schooling or teaching that you used to see only in high school and college, where the children sit in their seats and listen for an extended period of time at somebody talking to them. Now, even in high school and college, that's not the best way to learn. Because, if I said to you, suppose you're in a car and there's a driver and a passenger, who's going to remember the route better? No question, you would say the driver, because the driver has to actively use it. Even if the driver says to the passenger continuously during the route what he's doing and where he's turning, the driver's going to know it better. We know that you learn better if you actively do. But we tend to forget that when we put children in school and have them lectured at without actively using the information at all. And young children, that's even more important for, because they're not built for sitting still for long periods. I think what we need in education is to go back to many of the practices that have gotten lost. I think there's a lot of wisdom to things that have survived in cultures for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we shouldn't throw them out too easily and think we know better. We know from research that I've done on Tools of the Mind program that social dramatic play, having the children just play the way kids used to play, like cops and robbers, really develops executive functions, and the children do better on academic outcome measures than other children who spend more time on academic instruction. So even if your goal is the same, you want better academic outcomes, we're not going about it in the right way, I don't think, in the best way. And then I think there are all kinds of other things to help children, like music and dance and art. Or physical exercise. We tend to think of those as thrills, as extras, as non-essential. But I think they're absolutely essential. If you think about learning to play a musical instrument, or playing on a sports team, or doing martial arts, or doing dance where you're part of a group, you have to exercise discipline and executive function, inhibition, because you have to stay at that and work at it and be persistent and practice and work. You have to use working memory to hold in mind all the complex instructions about how you're going to move and what you're going to do. You have to learn to work as a social group and get the joy of being part of a social group. You have to exercise flexibility in switching. Maybe in dancing you start that way and you go another way, or any number of reasons why things might change. In the social play, your friends may take the scenario in ways you never imagined. So on the fly, in real time, you have to flexibly switch. So I think that things that involve the children in actively doing, and things that are fun, so that the children enjoy being in school and enjoy doing the activities, and so are willing to keep doing them. Because to develop any skill, you need to exercise that a lot. You need to practice a lot. And children will practice a lot something they love, and will not practice so much something that they don't enjoy. So why not give them something they enjoy? So they like coming to school, they want to be part of it, and they spend significant time doing things that will help develop the very skills that we most want.
So what's striking in, I think, all of the examples that you gave is the involvement of the physical body. How, from a brain development point of view, what's the relationship of development of physical capacities to attention and learning and so forth?
Well, the brain doesn't respect the same divisions between motor and cognitive and attention that we tend to think about. So the same areas that we think about as important for motor, such as the cerebellum or premotor cortex or supplementary motor area, are important for cognition and attention, just as they're important for motor. And prefrontal cortex is not only important for cognition, it's also important for motor. So, for example, if you look at brain imaging, whenever you see dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activated for a cognitive task, even if you don't have to move, you see the cerebellum activated. And as cerebellar activation increases, dorsolateral prefrontal activation increases. As dorsolateral prefrontal activation decreases, cerebellar activation decreases. They're tightly coupled and they work together. SMA and premotor cortex are particularly important for sequential learning and execution. And that's important whether you're doing a sequential math operation or verbal operation or you're doing motor. It's used for both. And motor development shows as long an extended development as you see for cognitive development. So fine motor skills, visual motor coordination, isn't fully developed till your 20s either. So it's not as if motor is low level and cognition is exalted, and motor develops in little kids and cognition only develops in young adults. They are intimately related. And also, they obey the same rules. So for example, if I want you to shine at something quickly, I should give you massed practice, maybe 5 hours on it today, and you'll look good on that tomorrow, whether it's a cognitive skill or it's a motor skill. Mm-hmm. But if I want you to remember that and look good on it 6 months from now, mm-hmm. it's better if I give you spaced practice, maybe an hour on it every day for the next 5 weeks, where there are lots of intervening things. You're not going to look so good immediately, but you'll look much better later. And that's true for cognitive, and it's true for motor. So the laws of learning are the same for cognition and motor. It's a false dichotomy, I think.
That's fascinating. When you were talking, it reminded me of a phrase that my Buddhist teacher used very, very frequently, which was synchronizing body and mind. And now, obviously, he was not a scientist. He was trying to evoke an experience. But I would be interested in you as a scientist commenting on that phrase, synchronizing body and mind.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what it means. It could mean any number of things. I think a lot of times it has to do with learning by doing and learning through doing and learning in any number of different ways. So you learn kinesthetically and you learn verbally, and it becomes part of your being, and it also becomes part of your intellectual thought. And I think it's best when those are together, because each different way of knowing contributes something to the whole. So that's one way of thinking about it, but there are many ways of thinking it. It's a very deep statement, and there are many ways of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Also, in describing meditation, there's a very strong emphasis on what's called being present or being in the moment. And how does that relate from a cognitive development point of view?
Well, one way you can think about it is in terms of the epitome of sustained attention and focused attention. So we tend to not be able to hold our attention and focus. So we think about how hungry we are, or we think about what we're going to make for dinner, or we think about the remark that bothered me that somebody said yesterday, or we're constantly leaving the present experience. And it takes discipline, it takes executive function to keep us in the present moment. And again, you can see executive functions even in babies, but they're not fully mature till your early 20s. And anything gets better with practice. So things will develop on their own even if you don't try, but they'll get much better if you try.
So here's one of the things I wonder about. All this effort to train our minds and train our attention and meditate and get enlightened and wake up and so forth, isn't that just trying to get back to the condition of a lizard? And the lizard, it lives in the moment, presumably.
I think part of it is trying to get back to the Zen of archery and get our intellectualization and executive function out of there and go back to letting the subcortical areas, which have had so much more time in evolution to perfect what they do it. I think that's true. But I think part of the point of meditation is to be very aware, to be the opposite of being on automatic. And in that case, it would be not at all like a lizard,
Right.
because the lizard doesn't know what he knows. The lizard is just doing what comes naturally.
Right. Yeah. All right. And I should ask you about the Garrison Institute. You've been a member of the Leadership Council for the Initiative in Contemplation and Education since the beginning. And you've been here quite a few times now. How do you see the role or the significance of the Garrison Institute, and what would be your hopes for its role at 5 or 10 or 20 years from now?
Well, one of the huge benefits or good aspects of the Garrison Institute is that it's not really wedded to an ideology. So a lot of people who want to help children develop executive functions or help people learn to meditate are wedded to a certain specific way that you have to do this. And the Garrison Institute and the Leadership Council have been very open to exploring, okay, it doesn't really matter what your philosophy might be. Let's look at what benefits the children, what will get us to the goal we want. So it might be deep listening. It might be sitting and listening and being very still. Or it might be what Tish Jennings showed us, which is that everyone takes a bell and you walk in a circle or a line, and the goal is that nobody should make a sound with their bell. That's a walking meditation, very different approach to meditation. But it's trying to get at the same sort of thing. Or maybe it could be dance. I think the Garrison Institute is open to how can we achieve the goal of helping children be more focused in their attention, more aware, more compassionate. And what are the possible ways of doing this? And how can we tell if one works better than another? And if one seems to be working well, how can we help get it implemented? So I think that the openness to many possibilities and to connecting the thoughts and theories and basic science with application, with how can this be used in the real world, are wonderful aspects of the Garrison that are fairly unique.
Good, great, thank you. You reminded me, you mentioned compassion, and I wanted to ask you about the quality of compassion, empathy, caring from a developmental point of view. To what extent is that innate, and to what extent does it need to be cultivated?
I think it's both. You can see even in a baby that a baby is very tuned into the emotions of those around the baby. So, for example, my mother tells the story that I'm an only child, and the first time she gave me a bath, she was very nervous that she shouldn't drown this poor newborn. Mm-hmm. And so I'm picking up on her nervousness, and I'm crying my lungs out. And my father is worried that his wife is going to kill their baby. The baby sounds awful. So he was yelling at my mother so much, she went and got a neighbor who already had 3 children. And the moment the neighbor took me in her arms in the bath, I stopped crying. Mm-hmm. Babies are very attuned to what others are feeling. And even young children can show wonderful compassion to seeing suffering or sadness in another. But hurts can shut that down. A child who is made embarrassed because they felt compassionate, or is told that they're a sissy, or any number of things, or hurt themselves when they're reaching out, can make people more defensive and more closed in. I think that in the US there's been much too much emphasis on educating the intellect. Because suppose you have the brightest person in the world, but the person doesn't have compassion, doesn't care about others. That's not the end you want. What you want are people who will do for others, who care about others. And in terms of having a fulfilling life and being a happy person, of course you yourself will be happier if you're focusing on others and caring about others than if you're always focusing on yourself. But people don't always realize that. people think that I need, and I have to make sure that I get. But you never get enough if you just focus on that. Whereas we're all built evolutionarily to feel so much joy when we help another. Because, of course, in terms of evolution, it's the perpetuation of the species that's important, not the perpetuation of the individual. So we have been built that we want to perpetuate the species, and that means caring about others and doing for others.
Great. What have I missed? What else is on your mind? Or?
One thing that's interesting, so I'll just mention it, is the bidirectional relation between the area of the brain that I focus on, prefrontal cortex, which is important for executive function, and stress. So even mild stress floods prefrontal cortex with one of the neurotransmitters that's critical for prefrontal cortex, dopamine. And while prefrontal cortex needs dopamine to function, if you flood it, it's like flooding your engine with gasoline. It's not good. So stress will take prefrontal cortex offline. It can't function properly, even slight stress. And that's unique to prefrontal. It doesn't affect the other regions of the brain in the same way. But prefrontal cortex can also help you manage stress. So in one very interesting study where the lead author is Matt Lieberman, they showed people in a scanner a face, just a photograph of a face showing different emotions like anger or sadness or happiness. And in one condition, you just have to pick the word that labels the emotion. Is the person showing fear or anger? In another condition, you have to pick which one of two faces is showing the same emotion as the target face. So if this face is showing anger, which one of these two is showing anger? In another condition, you have to just observe the face. In another condition, you have to pick which name is the appropriate gender name for the gender of the person in the picture, or which of two pictures is showing someone of the same gender as the target face. Now, you have to think about what emotion that face is showing in the label condition where you have to pick a word, or in the matching picture condition where you have to show which picture is shown. But only in the label condition of all those 6 different conditions do you get a decrease in the activation of the amygdala, which is more activated when you're fearful yourself or angry, and only in that condition do you get increased activation of prefrontal. Just using one word, not even elaborate discourse on it, just using one word, one verbal label, increases activation of prefrontal, which then dampens your stress reaction in the brain and the amygdala. And psychoanalysts and therapists could have told you for generations that putting things into words, talking about them, helps you deal with the stress and get past it. And there's really no substitute for that. It's more effective than any other way. And the reason it works so well is that it activates prefrontal, which then dampens the amygdala. And being able to understand and have some story to make coherent why you're feeling some way is very important to letting that feeling go. It doesn't mean that the situation in the past was right. It means just that you have some coherent story to understanding it. And people have often said to me, why do I look at executive functions in prefrontal cortex in little kids? Prefrontal cortex isn't fully mature to your early 20s. So there's not enough biological substrate for a child of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 to get better at executive function. You know, why not wait till you have more of the brain region developed? So I say to those people, think about the legs of a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old's legs are not at their full adult length. They won't be at their full adult length for another 10 or 15 years. But a 2-year-old can walk. A 2-year-old can even run. So even with those very immature legs, it could subserve a lot of the function of what legs are supposed to do. And the same thing with prefrontal. It's immature in a 3-year-old or a 6-year-old, but it doesn't mean that it can't subserve executive functions to some extent. Not at their full adult level, but to some extent.
Great.
I'm done.